Hey brothers, I hope everybody's doing well out there. It's good to be together at Men's Midweek. I'm really happy to be able to share some thoughts that have been resonating with me. And prayerfully, it will meet your needs, build up your faith, and encourage you and inspire you to have a bigger perspective, to have a spiritual perspective on who you are and what God's trying to do in your life. And as men, we've been doing a theme for our midweeks. We've been talking about spiritual growth. If you remember last time, Ian talked about being deliberate about spiritual growth, being intentional about our spiritual well-being. Today, what I want to do is I want to talk about the fact that we all have to have a spiritual perspective. That if we really want to grow spiritually, our perspective really matters. Your perspective, your thinking. I don't know if you've thought about this. God really cares about our thinking. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, it says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is." I think about this idea of the renewing of your mind. God is concerned with our perspective. How we think matters to God. In order for us to grow spiritually, we need to be convinced about a couple things. And one is that God is with us. Remember, Jesus is called the Emmanuel, that God is with us, that God is with his people. And there's a comfort and encouragement we should receive from knowing that God is with me. Do you believe that God is with you when it's good and when it's bad? When it's sunshine and when it's rain? Whether you win or whether you lose? Do you believe that God is with you? There's something incredible about Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. It talks about how we are God's workmanship, that God is building something in me, that God is building something in you, through us, that this is God's workmanship. Ephesians 2:10, it talks about we are God's workmanship. We are God's work. And I don't know about you, whatever God builds is glorious. Whatever God builds is magnificent. Whatever God builds is great. That God is with us, that we are God's workmanship. We should take pride in a humble pride, right? Not proud like the world knows pride, but there is a humility we should have in knowing that God is with us, but also being proud that God is doing something within me that is so special. And because of that, we can have great dreams. We can have a vision for our life. We could be optimistic. It's so funny. Harvard University, right up the road. A Christian preacher was there visiting the president of Harvard. And he was having some time together, and he's about to leave. And just before the Christian preacher leaves, he asks the president of Harvard University. He says, "Tell me the one thing, the one challenge that your students have. What's the one thing?" And the Harvard president responded back, "The problem with our students is that a lot of them feel empty." And I think about, wow, just here are students in the greatest university in the world, unlimited opportunities, unlimited potential. And he identifies that the one thing these students struggle with most is a sense of emptiness, a sense of meaninglessness, and that there's a hole in their heart. I'm so grateful to God that he's called us out of a meaninglessness of the world. That pattern of the world that we were caught up in, that stuff is meaningless. and that we could have a renewed mindset, we could have a renewed mentality, that we could have a renewed perspective that God is with me and that He's working in me something great. If we're honest, though, we could all struggle and wrestle with this idea that God is with me, and this idea that God through me and in me is building something great. If we're honest, we could wrestle and struggle with that mindset. We could wrestle with that perspective. God, what are you talking about? Because I don't feel great today. I'm not doing well right now. You know, I remember for myself, there was a time where I was just really struggling with my faith a few years ago. I remember sitting in church, and I'm starting to wrestle. And of course, that negative thoughts started to creep in way before I was sitting in church, right? But I remember one Sunday specifically, I'm sitting in church with my wife, and I'm just really wrestling with my faith. And I'm comparing my experience with everyone else's, because everybody else seems like they're doing well and I'm not. Everybody else seems like they're happy and I'm not. And you know, you start to compare and look around the church, and everybody else seems like they're doing all right. And then you start looking in the world. Man, they seem happy, they seem joyful, they seem content. And me, I'm sitting here, I'm not happy. Have you ever felt that way? And I was just really going through a rough time. And even during that time, my wife was going through a debilitating depression that really turned our life upside down. And so there was a lot of different pressures just eating away at me. It was financial pressures, life pressures, marriage pressures. Just life was just kind of weighing me down. And it was hard for me to have a spiritual perspective. My mentality was very worldly. And it just seemed like I was just being beat down and my thoughts were just racing. And I remember feeling so frustrated, so angry. I just left the church service during church and I just went and sat in my car. Just angry, frustrated, blaming God, blaming everybody. And I started to even have thoughts, God, here am I became a Christian, and why am I going through this? And I deserve better, and why am I feeling this way? And it was hard for me to see, as Ephesians 2 tells us, that I'm God's workmanship. That God is building something in me, that He's still working in me. And it was just hard to have that perspective. And to be honest with you, my perspective was definitely in the gutter. And I'm sitting in my car angry. I lost perspective on God. I lost perspective on who He is. And I lost perspective of what He's doing in my life. Perspective matters. Perspective is crucial to our spiritual growth. And in that moment, I just lost sight. I lost perspective. I lost vision. I lost drive. I lost hope. And life became about just the daily grind. Just get through another day. And I just was not happy. And I was feeling the effects of just all the different emotions. And I couldn't really grab a hold of my thinking at that moment. You know, I think about a story about a guy that walks up to just a construction site, and he sees three guys. Now, these three guys, they're doing the exact same thing. They have the same job. They're laying bricks. But this gentleman is curious to ask these guys who are working this construction site, and he says to the first guy, he walks up to him, he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And the first guy says, "Well, I'm laying down bricks." He goes to the second guy. He says, "Hey, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a wall." And then he goes to the next guy and he says, "What are you doing?" And the third guy says, "I'm building a magnificent cathedral." Now think about this. Three guys doing the same job, doing the same thing, laying down bricks, but they have a radically different perspective on what they're doing. You know, the first two guys, hey, they're doing their job. They're grinding it out. Not very inspiring, not very special. They're doing their job, but they're laying down some bricks. But the third guy had a different mindset. He was doing the exact same thing, but with a purpose and with a vision in mind, that he sees the end from the beginning, that he has the big picture going, that he sees an opportunity. And in his mind, he's not just laying down some bricks like the other two guys. He's building something magnificent. Now, mind you, he's doing the exact same thing, laying down bricks, but he has a radically different perspective. He has a vision in mind of what's going on. And I want to ask you, when it comes to your faith, what is your perspective on your life right now? What's your perspective on what's going on? Are you merely laying down bricks? You're just kind of just getting by the day-to-day grind? Or are you building a magnificent cathedral? Are you building something amazing? You know, with that third person, again, he had that purpose, that passion, that vision, that drive. If we're going to grow spiritually, we have to ask ourselves, how is my perspective? Do I have the big picture in mind in what God is trying to do in my life? And sometimes that's not always clear in the moment. But the key is remembering that God is with me and that I'm his workmanship, that he's building something. Whether there's sunshine or whether there's rain. Whether it's good or whether there's bad. Whether I'm winning or I feel like I'm losing. If we're going to grow spiritually, we have to put on God's perspective. Look at life through God's lenses. See life through a spiritual point of view. Otherwise, we could just get caught up on the day-to-day grind. Hey, I'm just laying some bricks. I'm not really motivated. I'm not really excited about my faith, you know. And if you live that way, you could miss out on what God is trying to do in your life. And sometimes in order to see the magnificent building that God's trying to create, you have to wait around a little bit. You have to be a little bit patient. You can't rush something great. Just things that are built overnight are usually cheap and flimsy, and they break down. But things that are done well take time. There's a craftsmanship that happens. That God is working and weaving and putting things together in your life. But it takes time. Are you patient enough to see it through? That's the question. A spiritual perspective, it reminds me of the story of Joseph. Do you guys remember the story of Joseph in Genesis? Maybe some of you are not familiar, but I want to do a recap of the story of Joseph, a very brief recap, and we're going to just read a brief scripture out of Genesis chapter 45. But let me remind you about the story of Joseph. Let me give you a brief version of it. Joseph is basically Jacob's son. Joseph has several brothers, and Joseph, being the youngest of several brothers, he actually wound up being his dad's favorite. And he has this incredible dream that he's going to be bigger than his brothers. And that in fact that people are going to be bowing down to him. You know, Joseph's mistake is that he shares that with his brothers. How do you think his brothers responded? They were angry. They were jealous. They did not like Joseph's dream and what he had to say. And not only that, he's daddy's favorite. He's the youngest, and man, there was certainly a deep hate for Joseph in this dream. So much so that his brothers wanted to kill Joseph. In fact, they throw him in the pit and leave him for dead. And then they decide, you know what, let's just sell him off into slavery. Let's just sell him. Let's get something for him. He sells, these brothers sell their youngest brother off, Joseph, and he's sold and he gets carried down to Egypt to be bought by another gentleman named Potiphar. And he's a slave in Potiphar's house. Unfortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of raping her. She tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph refused because he was righteous. He didn't want no part of it. And unfortunately, Potiphar found out about it, and Joseph was thrown in jail, having done what's right, having done nothing wrong. And he's left to rot in jail, sold out by his brothers, mistreated. He's accused of rape. He's thrown in jail. And it's just a rough time. And eventually what happens over time, it became known in the jail that Joseph could interpret dreams. And someone he was in jail with wound up going to tell the king of Egypt about Joseph. You see, during this time, God would have it that Pharaoh started having these dreams he couldn't interpret. He needed someone to come interpret them. And Pharaoh found out about this guy Joseph in a jail cell that could interpret dreams. So he says, hey, Joseph, why don't you come and interpret this dream that I'm having? And Joseph interprets a severe famine that's going to engulf the whole land. And what Joseph does, being savvy and smart and administratively responsible, he sets up a game plan to be able to weather this famine, to be able to weather the storm that's going to affect everybody. It's going to hit everybody. But at least they could plan for it and get ahead of it. And so what Pharaoh does is he makes Joseph pretty much a ruler in the land. And during this time, his brothers unknowingly trekked down to Egypt. They didn't know he was still alive. They didn't even know where he was. They trekked down to Egypt to get help from Pharaoh and Egypt. Because now they're in dire straits and their father's not doing well. And they don't even recognize Joseph, who's now a ruler in Egypt. And in Genesis chapter 45, we find the interaction with Joseph and his brothers. Will he be angry? Will he be bitter? Will he be vindictive? These brothers that sold him and left him for dead, how would he respond now, years later? Let's turn to Genesis 45. I want to just read in verse 4 through 8. It says this. It says, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When they had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold in Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all of Egypt." What an incredible interaction. Joseph and his brothers. He says, "It was not you who sent me, but God." There's no anger, no bitterness, no vindictiveness. I don't know about you, but I would be ready to put them in their place. He said, no, it wasn't you. It was God who sent me. That God was with me in the mess. That God was with me in the struggle. That he was there in the hardship. That he was there in the jail cell. He was there when I was accused of rape. He was there when I was thrown into this pit and left for dead. That God was with me. That he's never stopped being with me. What is incredible about Joseph is that he sees God in every situation in his life. Think about his perspective. That he finds a purpose in every situation, and God's hand is in everything. You know, as disciples, it could be so easy to lose our perspective. We're just laying some bricks. We're consumed with life. We're just getting caught up with our duties, obligations, and responsibilities. And we have a short-sighted view of God. And we have a short-sighted view of what God is trying to do in our life. And I just think about, you know, for myself, going back, you know, I came to this point. Remember, I'm sitting in my car. And in that moment, God wasn't enough for me. That his presence wasn't enough. I got so caught up in this just day-to-day thing, and I lost sight of God. You know, I'm so grateful for the grace of God. You know, through the cross, Jesus says, I still have a plan for you. I still have a life for you. I'm still building something great for you. You know, in John 10, verse 10, Jesus says, I have come so that you would have life and life to the full. That there is a meaning and a purpose, and I'm not done with you yet. I have a vision for your life. See, it's with that perspective that we need to live. And that perspective will dictate our thoughts, and our thoughts will dictate our life, and that will dictate our spiritual growth. When you look at Joseph's life, I'm so inspired by him. Did he have a Bible? No. Did he have the church? No. Did he have family support? No. Did he have a support system? No. He had none of that. Did he get a raw deal with life? Did he get dealt a bad hand? Absolutely. Did he try to remain righteous and it backfired, blew up in his face? Yes. But he never lost sight that God is with me and that God is building something great. He says, God has put me here for a great deliverance. God has put me here to impact so many people that I went from a miserable place to a ruler in the palace of Egypt for a purpose that God had me here. You know, Joseph incredibly never lost sight of that. He never lost sight of that. And I'm just amazed at Joseph. But I think that's a faith and a perspective worthy of imitation. And today we read about him because he never lost his perspective. And in fact, his mindset inspires us all. His vision inspires us all. The fact that he was able to see God through everything is absolutely incredible. What a visionary he was. The vision to see God in everything. A spiritual perspective. You know, I want to close with this. I want to ask you, are you a bricklayer or are you a visionary? Are you laying down a brick or do you believe that God is building something magnificent in your life? I want to challenge you to have some spiritual goals, to have some spiritual dreams in a vision now. Think of how God could use you even now, and to be patient enough that God is working and building for the long haul. So there's a patience we need to have, just like Joseph was patient. But we understand if we are patient enough and faithful, that we'll be able to experience God's incredible workmanship, that he's building something magnificent in us and through us. And so as we close, I want you to think about how your perspective makes a difference on life. If you can have the right perspective, you can spiritually grow. If you have the wrong perspective, you could be like me, sitting in the car just angry. But God has called us to something better. And so I want to challenge you to set some spiritual goals and to be patient enough to see God work in your life. The 3 questions I want to leave you to discuss with your groups is this. How would you describe your attitude? Am I laying down a brick or am I building something magnificent? What's my attitude about that? My second question is, How can you imitate Joseph's faith when it gets hard? How can you imitate Joseph's faith? How can you imitate his perspective? My third question is, what is one goal that you can write down now and work towards? What's one spiritual goal that you could write down right now and work towards? You know, I want to thank you guys so much for your time. I hope that the story of Joseph inspired you, and I hope that it calls you higher to have a spiritual perspective. And we all together could work together to see that God is building something magnificent in us. We are God's workmanship. God is with us. Let's have a spiritual perspective and watch our faith grow. Thank you so much.